Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is our webinar for today at 12 o'clock on Friday, the 5th of July. Today, we're going to be talking about mediation and new technology. I'm Dr. Mike Talbot, and I'm the founder and CEO of UK Mediation. Just a very quick word about me before we begin our webinar for today. I started UK Mediation just over 20 years ago. I am originally a psychotherapist, so I've come into this field with knowledge about how people tick and how people's relationships can fail and what it is about conflict that works at a sort of psychological level, why it's so difficult to get out of conflict, what we need when we're in conflict, and what a mediator can add to a process of conflict resolution. So very much looking at this field and the field of mediation from the angle of the psychology of the processes that underpin conflict and informing what we do as mediators on the basis of our own theoretical model as well, which we've developed over the last 20 years of how to solve conflict. We work in neighbourhoods, we work in workplaces, we do commercial work. I personally work with boards of directors and committees. We do a lot of work with third sector, with charities, resolving conflict, commercial conflict and interpersonal conflict. The only thing we don't do is mediation for divorce and separation. We leave that to others to do. So here we are this afternoon. You're very welcome to join us. I see we have a large number of people on this afternoon, not just from the UK, but from all around the world. So hoping to have you join in with us this afternoon using your chat box. You will notice the chat box to the right of your screen. If you have a comment or a question that you'd like to ask, do it throughout the course of the webinar. We will leave a bit of time at the end for Q&A as well, in case there's anything that you've not got around to saying. But if there's something you'd like to chip in as we progress through the webinar, please do, and I'll do my best to address it. So let's see what we're going to do. I will be speaking for around about 40 minutes, and various reminders to make sure I don't go on, because I could talk about a fortnight about this stuff, so I'll try and keep it to 40 minutes, and I will be talking about how new technology and social media can contribute to disputes developing, how they can perpetuate conflict, and how they can get people into trouble at work. So we have the ubiquitous mobile phones, but also tablets and other devices that people have got their Facebook on, their Instagram, their Twitter accounts, also texting people, twos and fros throughout the working day. What can be the contribution of these processes to disputes developing at work? How do they get perpetuated, and how can people get into trouble? So we've got a few things to say about that, and then we'll talk about social media policies, about the policy of how much will be allowed and what the nature of that activity would be allowed in the workplace. Talk about what's needed there, and whether new technology can be a force for conflict resolution. So on the positive side, can we get to some kinds of resolutions using social media and other new technologies. So here we go. Let's have some figures. In time-honoured fashion, we find that 57% of managers feel uncomfortable when a staff member sends them a friend request. Would it be weird if one of your staff members sent you a friend request, if you're their manager? How would that feel? Depends how well you know them, but more than half of managers do feel uncomfortable when they get such a request. 70% of employers will use social media to screen candidates, so this has really shot up from 11% in 2006, this is on a Harris poll, up to the present day. When you're applying for a job, the employer or whoever it is who's screening candidates is likely to look for your Facebook page, see you on that wild weekend in Magaluf, and maybe use that to inform their decision as to whether they should take you on as an employee. So there have been some scare stories over the years, especially when people are not careful about what gets shared on their Facebook and on their Insta, that a potential employee can get a real flavour of how that person is in their private life, despite how they're presenting themselves in their professional life at a job interview, and would use that to screen candidates. On a more legitimate side, I suppose, it's looking at people's LinkedIn, looking at their achievements, their qualifications, looking at whether they are active. But there we go, nearly 3/4 of employees are likely to screen you using social media if you apply for a job with them, and there's 17% of workers will also use social media to learn about a colleague. So if they want to find something out about a colleague, well, you can imagine all sorts of circumstances, coming in Monday morning bleary-eyed, or they're particularly quiet today, or they've gone missing for a few days. Quite a significant number of people there. What's that? About 1 in 6 people would be likely to use social media to check up on colleagues and learn about other people's private lives. So a few figures there, to show that social media, where it impinges on sort of working relationships, really. How would it feel if one of your team sent you a friend request? Maybe you don't know them all that well. How would it feel if you knew you were being screened for a job application? How would it feel if you knew that a colleague had been looking you up on Facebook, looking you up and seeing what you've been posting on your Instagram? How would that affect the relationship between the two of you? Which is what we're all about, really, at UK Mediation. We're about mending relationships. We look at conflict as a breakdown in relationship, as a failure of dialogue. And you can see already how these kinds of things that I've just discussed with those percentage figures could actually impinge on a relationship, could affect the dialogue that goes on between 2 or more people. So how does social media contribute to the development of disputes? Well, there's quite a few ways that this can happen. So, for example, somebody posts a disparaging comment about another person, and we know that particularly with sorts of abbreviations that we use on posts on social media, there is room for misinterpretation. Using sarcasm and humour on social media can often be misinterpreted, especially if it's by people that you don't know that well. So disparaging comments that get shared or retweeted. Somebody gets it, passes it on, retweets it, shares it with friends, and maybe misinterpreting along the way, either wantonly or otherwise, what then gets seen. So this gives rise to gossip, and there is dialogue, or sometimes no dialogue, about the upset that gets caused by these kinds of posts, and there arises a dispute. So very typical, and in all the cases that we do here, some thousands of cases over the last 20 years at UK Mediation, we can quite safely say that especially we find for neighbourhood disputes and disputes where there might be families involved, just seems to be the way it goes. There can be this contamination of the dispute, contamination of the relationships between people by these kind of uses of social media. Happens at work as well, but seems to be particularly prevalent in neighbourhood disputes and disputes that involve families. But then there's the question about how social media can perpetuate conflict. How can the sort of stuff that we do actually worsen or prolong conflict? One of the things that happens is that people retweet and share posts without comment. So the implication there, if you don't comment on something that you retweet or share, is that you agree with the initial tweet or post. It may not actually be your intention, and it's always an issue in all sorts of disputes where 2 people fall out and they misinterpret one another's intentions. It's a big part of the model that we use, that we've developed here, is talking about the projections that people have onto one another. So when 2 people are in dispute and they have a conflict, A will imagine what B is thinking and B will imagine what A is thinking. And in the absence of a decent dialogue, quite often that will be a negative projection. So they will say, she's got it in for me, she doesn't like me, she's never welcomed me into this team. And the other person might say, he's swinging the lead, he just does as little as he can get away with, he's talking behind my back, he's never made himself manageable to me. There's lots of ways that we can misinterpret one another's motives and project these things. And if you bring social media into that, if you're retweeting and sharing stuff without comment, that gives the receiver an invitation to try and interpret your motives. And like I say, in disputes, when we start interpreting other people's motives, we quite often get it wrong, and it's quite often negative. Other thing that happens is when these posts get shared around, maybe they don't get sent to a particular person or a particular couple of people. So we might selectively exclude people, or if we're trying to whip it up, and again we've seen quite a bit of this, if we're trying to whip up a dispute or trying to make a point, we might selectively include people. So we actually send these posts or share these posts or retweet these posts to some people on purpose, because we know it will push their buttons, or we know it'll have the desired effect. The thing I said about projection, so there we go, in this whole process we're projecting, we're attributing thoughts and feelings to other people that don't necessarily belong to them. It happens in face-to-face dialogue, but where we have the lack of face-to-face, where it takes place between 2 mobile phone screens, there's so much more potential for these projections of actually misreading and misinterpreting another person's motives. We also deflect, not a bit of jargon for you. So what do? We pretend everything's okay. So we smile at people through clenched teeth. We have dialogue, conversations that appear to be okay, but actually at the back of our minds you're thinking, you so-and-so, you've gone and posted that thing about me this morning, or you retweeted that thing that somebody else posted about me. So we hold back on what really needs to be said. We retroflect. So there's a few things here in this jargon which are actually parts of the model that we've developed at UK Mediation over the last 20 years, the underlying model of the psychological processes that are there in conflict. And all of this is in evidence in face-to-face disputes, but also here over the sort of social media-driven disputes. We have the projection, mind reading. We have the deflection, where people pretend everything's okay when it isn't. Smiles that don't quite go to the eyes. And we retroflect. We hold back on saying things that really need to be said. We clench our jaw. We don't say the difficult thing. And what can ultimately happen in these kind of settings is you get factionalism, particularly in teams. So you'll have a small group of people who know what was posted or retweeted, maybe a group who've been excluded from the shares and retweets. You'll have the group of people who started the whole thing, or maybe a group of people who are blissfully unaware of what's going on at all. So you get this factionalism within teams, and this can fester, and if it's not addressed very, very quickly, in our experience, things can go quite badly wrong. Things can worsen almost overnight. So how does this sort of get people into trouble? Was the other thing I was going to talk about as well. How can social media get people into trouble at work? Well, you can imagine from the previous couple of slides how this might play out, how it might develop into bother. But people get into trouble at work for excessive use of social media. There have been a number of cases that we've worked with where somebody's been accused of spending too long on their Facebook during the working day, and when challenged they said, no, I wasn't, I was Googling something that was to do with work. And it's a tricky one, that. So unless we look over people's shoulders, or we have a policy where we need to know what people are actually doing on their devices, it's very tricky to police this. And when challenged, quite often if people are using their Facebook or they're on Instagram half the day, when challenged they'll say, no, I wasn't, I was doing something that was work related. But that excessive use can cause a real problem. The other thing is when people are posting stuff that doesn't really, it's not made clear whether it's personal or professional. So somebody within an organisation who's posting stuff, and if we're not careful about this, making this distinction very clear and overt, it can look as if that person's personal opinions are those of their employer. And this can rebound on the employer, particularly if they are malicious or inappropriate posts, when actually it was something personal, but the poster hasn't made it clear, and it looks like this is the company or their organisation that's actually expressing this opinion or view. So that's another way that people can get into trouble at work with social media. And the other thing is where private spats, things that start as just an exchange between two individuals. Quite often, if this does develop into a dispute, one of the things that we tend to do is, if we think somebody is badly in the wrong and that they've wronged us, or they've behaved wrongly, we do have a bit of a tendency to try and broadcast it, to tell the world what an awful person that this other fellow is. So our private spats can become quite public when we start to share in more public fora things that should really remain private, and that can begin to reflect badly on a corporate image. And we have seen this again in some commercial disputes, where somebody's business was quite severely compromised by something that had been posted by an individual within the organisation, and where it looked as if that it was the company. I think he or she did it on the company account, as it happens, and the company had to sort of deal with the fallout from this post that ought to have been indicated very clearly that it was personal and not anything to do with that organisation. And the last one here, we've come across this quite a lot. It's a surprising thing to us, which is that people say, well, I only meant it for this person or that person. I meant to keep it private, and I only posted it on this Facebook page with these checks or with these restrictions on who can view content, or put it on Twitter, but I took it down straight away. And there was a large and significant situation where somebody did tweet something which was potentially quite inflammatory, and he or she took it down straight away, but a good 20 or 30 people had taken a screenshot of it by the time he or she took it down. And it certainly didn't remain private. This was something that was widely publicised and passed around. So if a post is made, it's public. There's no way that you can possibly consider that things are private if they appear anywhere on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram. People are going to screenshot them. Okay, so don't want to bring you down too much for this Friday afternoon talking about all the ills of social media, but let's have a think about how we can constrain and contain this. How can we have a policy? What sort of thing do we need within an organisation for a social media policy? Now, I'll just remind you about the chat box here. If you've had any experiences of writing a social media policy, or if you have a particularly effective or ineffective policy within your own organisation, it'd be good to hear from you right now. So as we go through, it'd be good to hear your thoughts and comments about some of this stuff I'm talking about. Don't be shy, pop it in the chat box as we proceed. So I wonder what's needed for a good social media policy. Well, coming back to the thing I just mentioned, we need to encourage users, the employees, to make a clear distinction between their use of personal and company accounts. Don't make personal posts on the company ticket, and if you are making personal posts, the best thing is not to mention your employer, especially during the working day, because this can be tagged and can appear in a search. So keep personal separate from professional. Make a clear distinction between these two things. That's a key need, I would say, for any social media policy. And I think the organisation can also contribute to an explicit disclaimer. So anything that you might precede any posts that you make whilst you're actually sitting at work, by saying this is a personal view, it's got nothing to do with my employer. My views are my own, they are not the view of name of employer. So you can have that there as an explicit disclaimer on your account. It's not a bad idea, just to make sure that people appreciate that it's you and not your employer. Also, the trash talk. If you assume that the target of your posts is going to read what you'd write, would you say it to their face? So think about, and I've had this with my own teenagers, where some things have blown up because of what they've posted about others, and this has been my comment to them. If that person had been in front of you at that time, would you have said that thing to their face? And quite frequently they go, no, I wouldn't do that. So be aware, that just hiding behind the screen, hiding behind a keyboard, doesn't make the talk any less trashy or persecutory. And if you've got negative or defamatory things to say about people, just ask yourself that question, would you say it to their face? Just a little comment here from Sarah. Sarah, thank you very much. Sarah says, I'm updating our social media policy. Some colleagues want a complete ban during the working day due to past problems, and I'm inclined to be more relaxed about it. Thoughts? Well, I think, let me just finish this slide actually, and then I think I'll answer that question, Sarah L. Thank you very much, great question. Anybody else got any thoughts or questions as we go along? Do pop them up there, and I'll try and address them as we go. So I'll just finish this slide, Sarah, and then I'll come back to your question. So what's needed? So if you retweet something with no comment, this implies that you're endorsing the original comment. So always, as a matter of policy, a personal policy as well as a corporate policy really, add a neutralising comment of your own, or make sure that people who read that appreciate that it's not necessarily your own view. So you say, I'm retweeting this but I don't necessarily agree with it, or I'm retweeting this thing which is putting one side of an argument, but there is this other side to this argument. So you're kind of neutralising the thing that you're retweeting. So if you do it without comment, it looks like you're endorsing or agreeing with the original content, and this can turn into sort of a chain of whispers if you're not careful. Next person that does it without comment, and depending on who they send it to, it can be interpreted in a particular way. So let's be really clear what's your view and what isn't, and I think it's polite and also contains the risk if you add a neutralising comment of your own. Next thing we would say about social media policy is check your privacy settings. It's amazing how much stuff people share really widely and just put out there, and I sometimes see what people put on Facebook and I think, wow, if your employer saw what you'd put out there, or a potential employer saw sort of some of that content that you've got on Facebook, would they give you a job? So check your privacy settings, know who can see what. make sure that some things that perhaps should just be for your inner circle are only seen by your inner circle. Don't assume that anything that's out there is private. So there's a few more things to say about that, and the reason I was waiting, Sarah, is to say that there's quite a good sample social media policy on that link there. So if you follow that link or cut and paste that link, it's a Hootsuite article. All credit goes to them, with a sample social media policy for employees. Quite good. But to come back to your question, Sarah, as well as saying that that might be a useful link for you, I do know organisations where there is a complete ban, and some of the organisations I'm thinking of are places where it's very security conscious, not just in this country, but overseas. We've worked a bit with the Foreign Office. I've done some work in a number of embassies around the world, and in those very security sensitive places, especially where devices can also be used to activate things, they basically have an array of lockers in reception at the building, and you turn your phone off and you put it in a locker and you leave it there till the end of the working day. That's maybe a slightly extreme example. Other places, what they have is they have time limits on when you can use your device, but mostly they seem to enforce it. They need to take people's phones and devices and put them somewhere. Again, there's anything from a box at the top of the office by the door, where all the phones go in there. So if you see somebody on the phone during the working day, as I said earlier, you can't tell what they're doing. It might be work, it might not. It might be an emergency call that's come from the school. Somebody's got kids, or if they have a dependent. But you just don't know, as an employer, what somebody's using their phone for. The only way to be sure that people are not going to use their phones is to put them somewhere, such as a box at the top of the room, and then allow certain times that people can access their phones. So it depends what the contract is, what the agreement is. So within the employment contract, there may well be, and there is in many people's employment contracts now, or in employee handbooks at least, there is a paragraph on social media policy. If that's what the employee agrees, then that's what it is. So long as they know up front before they take a job that this is what's going to happen. And as ever, consultation is key. Organisations where you've got landlines, you could argue that, well, okay, if the school needs to ring you, or your elderly dependent needs to ring you during the day, or any other emergency that you would need to be alerted for, they can use the landline. Which, you could argue, I can see both sides of that argument, but you could argue that that's okay. You're at work, you can be accessed by your landline, you don't need your mobile on. In another organisation that I'm thinking of, at 12 o'clock each day, people were allowed to use their phones until 2, and then they had to go away again. So there's various ways of doing it, Sarah. How relaxed do we want to be about it? How concerned are we? Is the nature of the job such that it doesn't matter if people are on their phones? If you're customer facing and a customer wants to speak to a member of staff and they've got their head down and they're checking their Facebook, then that could be a big issue. But in other industries where you're not so customer facing, it might not be quite such a big deal. So there we go. Thanks for your question, Sarah. Let's just move on a little bit then and think about whether new technology can be a force for conflict resolution. So we've heard quite a bit about online mediation. We talk about video links for mediation. Telephone mediation has been around for quite a long time. What can we do? Well, let's say yes is the answer to that question. If we consider that clearing the air in any form is better than not clearing the air at all. So people might be and are quite reticent to walk towards face-to-face mediation sometimes. It's fair to say that part of the skill of a mediator is encouraging people to come into face-to-face communication with their adversary. And understandably, people can be quite scared about that. They're worried for their not their own safety as such, because the mediator will keep a check on that, but they're worried about being humiliated, being shown up to be in the wrong. They're concerned that the other person will use angry words and an angry volume of speech. Sometimes people are worried about their own behaviour. I don't trust how I'm going to behave if I get face to face with this person that I'm really, really angry with. So if you've got new technology as a way of bringing about a conversation that otherwise wouldn't happen, then I'd say that's a big yes. In terms of telephone mediation or Skype mediation over WhatsApp video is something that people do in a particular setting that we work in. And the other thing is, we find that bit of a sigh. bit of a sigh slipped out there, because it happens so much that when a relationship begins to break down, people start batting off angry emails to each other. BCCing in the manager, oh, what a bad move. Tends to sort of really make things a lot worse. BCCing other colleagues as they send angry emails to somebody across the other side of the office. So if we can bring it into a group forum, it's better than just batting out these angry emails to one or two people at a time. So the thing is about working in groups is, you know, we tend to be a bit more cautious about what we say and what we do. There's a phenomenon called risky shift. It might be worth Googling, especially those of you who work with teams and groups. This phenomenon of risky shift, it's where we're a little bit more cautious when we're in a group than when we are in private. And in a group forum, we may choose our words more carefully. Supposing there's a group chat, in order to try and resolve a misunderstanding, we would choose our words more carefully. We would phrase things rather more generously. We might be a bit less critical and persecutory of other colleagues. We might even be more prepared to accept our own responsibility for what's gone wrong. And I think within the sort of risky shift phenomenon, this is something that happens. And it might, in a group, be far more a conciliatory process, and more collaborative, and more a process of more resolution than if it's just a one-to-one email exchange, angry email exchange. So yes, again, the group forum setting can bring about a better dialogue than just one-to-one. Now, there's been some success using artificial intelligence to mediate commercial disputes. When I was preparing for this webinar, I was looking at a few things on YouTube. There's a little thing, there's a robot mediator. It's used for kids. So it's got an automatic speech recognition thing in it, same as Alexa or any of those speech recognition things that you sit on your kitchen worktop. And it can sense when there's a conflict, and it offers to resolve the conflict between two kids playing, for example. There's a really good film on YouTube, a little boy and girl playing with some blocks, and they start to fall out, and the robot mediator chips in and tries to resolve it for them. I think it's more a bit of fun than anything practical at the moment, but as with a lot of AI applications, it starts off with the fun, and then we see, hang on a second, there's a serious application for this. This could really work. Excuse me. So we've had limited success using artificial intelligence to mediate disputes. Can't yet account for the emotions involved. Some of the work I did long before I came into this field was working in research with British Telecom, and we used to do research on voice recognition and recognition of people making inquiries over the telephone and automatically recognising what they're saying. And there was some work that went on at that time about recognising emotion and how emotion can affect people's voice patterns. It's a very complex thing to do, because there's such a variety of voices, and you know, people express emotion in very different ways. So it's quite a tricky thing. But when it's a dry commercial dispute, there is I can see some limited potential for having automated mediation. But only really, for me, when I think there's a massive component of emotion in any dispute, even when it's around a commercial matter. It can't yet account for emotions that are involved in these kinds of disputes. So let's carry on with this question, really, a very important question. Can new technology be a force for conflict resolution? And now I'll give you the other side of the argument, really, in saying that not really, if you consider that mediation needs to be kept private. And we've done a few cases and come across a few cases where you can't tell who's in the room. You don't know whether somebody's recording it. You don't know what the overriding security settings and provisions are. So you need to keep mediation private. And there have been a couple of instances, one or two of them are actually documented, they're out there. There's a thing about it on mediate.com, if anybody's interested, www.mediate.com, where you don't know that there's actually somebody else in the room, even when you're doing a video mediation, because you only see a particular frame, a particular shot. There could even be somebody else there in the room. So that is a big issue. And where it says there who is in the room, and that's actually who's in the room, is what we're talking about. So online dispute resolution security is an issue. In the case of drier, less personal disputes, where it's more to do with an amount of money or something quite transactional, something to do with very specific behaviours, a mediator can make a better online discussion happen. And there are some dedicated pieces of software that are out there. They're quite easy to find. where a mediator is the third party in a discussion, an impartial third party. A and B have their video link, a mediator appears as well, and we can make a better discussion happen, provided participants are willing to give it a go, of course. Just a fairly standard thing in mediation, whether it's online or not. Yeah, we can make a discussion happen. So better than just a video conversation between two parties, if we have the presence of an impartial third party also on the video link, and it can work. But the no part here is, when it's more personal, more heartfelt, when there's more emotion involved. I don't find it's very effective doing it online. I have tried, and I've seen people try, and I've helped people to try and make it work. But I for my own personal preference, is that you need to be in the same room as the other guy. You need to see the whites of his or her eyes to have a thorough conversation, and to really let the other person know how their words and behaviours have impacted on you, and for them to hear how your words and behaviours have impacted on them. I find it needs to be face to face. So that's kind of what I've said there in that last point. So I would say, in summary, for that question, really, can new technology be a force for conflict resolution? Yeah, if it's fairly dry, if it's commercial. Yeah, if you can have the security issue addressed. No, if it's more heartfelt, if it goes deeper, if it's a lot to do with emotion and resentment and people's anger with each other, I think you need to get people face to face. And my experience is that is a highly effective way to resolve disputes. It tends to be watered down a bit when you're doing it online. So a couple of questions coming in by email and on the chat screen. So let's lead into addressing that. So Q&A. I will drift on a little bit while we do that. My colleague has just put up a couple of links there for you. So we've got a link to mediate.com. We've got a link to the social media policy there from Hootsuite. I'm just looking at any further questions coming in now. As I'll just wander on a little bit and talk about some upcoming webinars. As questions arrive, I will address them. So if you ever want to register for webinars, or if you want to share this link for other people, there it is on screen there. It's go to our website, it's /webinars. And you can find a list of upcoming webinars as well, which I'll tell you about in just a second. So I have a question come in from Paula. Paula, thank you very much. Paula's joined us from overseas today. Thank you very much, Paula, one of our attendees from around the world, who says that a client has a claim against a builder who left some work half done. The lady doesn't want to be in the same room as the builder. Can telephone mediation work in this context? I'll give you a straight yes to that one, Paula. And you may know that over recent years, mediation has been very much promoted with the small claims process. So through county courts, there appeared on the allocation form for cases, small claims cases, there appeared a box, and in that box it said, how about using mediation? And initially in that box it said, what objections would you have to using mediation? And you had to justify why you wouldn't want to use mediation. If people give it a go, you get a free telephone mediation from the mediator, who is employed by the court, actually sits in a room down the corridor from the courtrooms, and the mediator there will phone each side alternately. I think you get an hour, and will aim to resolve exactly this kind of dispute. So sorts of things where money is owed, where work is incomplete, where there are issues with building projects, especially, Paula, there can often be issues to do with snagging, where the job isn't finished off completely to the client's satisfaction. They want the builder to come back. Builder says they've finished it, and you get into this rather sort of stalemate position where the client says, well, I'm not paying you till this job's done, and the builder says, well, I'm not going to come back on site until you paid me the last instalment that's outstanding. So very common sort of situation. If you don't want to be in the same room as the builder, then you've got the option for telephone mediation. So I would strongly suggest that use that through the local court, or speak to somebody like us. It is something that we do. It's quick and easy. It means you don't have to leave your own desk. And a little confession I've got to make, that over 25 years I've been running businesses, including this one for 20 years. There have been one or two disputes with people over niggardly things, and I've used telephone mediation 3 times, and it was successful twice. And one of the times it was successful, it took us 20 minutes on the phone. and I didn't even have to leave my desk. We settled this dispute 20 minutes, got to the point of a binding agreement, and that was, for me, that was just brilliant. I need no other proof that that kind of mediation works. Another one here from over email. It says, I've taken your IMPC course, that's our interpersonal mediation practitioner certificate course, which was excellent, by the way. Thank you very much. I do believe it is excellent. And this questioner says they're starting to take on cases as a freelancer. Oh, good. Pleased to hear it. So they've done our training, which they're telling us was excellent, and they're thinking about taking on cases as a freelancer. And they've had a request to mediate a workplace dispute where there have been claims of, quotes, sexualized banter, close quotes. One party's overseas, and you've been asked to do the mediation via Skype. Any advice? Well, it's a good example of where I think if you could possibly get the parties even in the same building, you would have a much better chance of success. I have found that it can just be frustrating when it's something that is very emotionally ridden, where it's something that's very hurtful, where the allegations are of a level such as that, of quite inappropriate and quite persecutory behaviour. I find that you need to at least have a shuttle with the two parties present. The shuttle process is where we have the parties in separate rooms, potentially bringing them together into one room, or start with the use a conventional face-to-face mediation process. So I think that one, in contrast to the one about the builder, so Paula's case, talking about a builder leaving work undone, yes, I would go for telephone mediation for that one. But this one, where it's quotes sexualized banter, close quotes, I'm saying quotes because I've got some thoughts about the use of the term banter in those kind of settings. I think it tends to almost forgive some quite inappropriate bullying and persecutory behaviours. But one party's overseas, you're thinking about doing it via Skype? I'm not sure. But if you want to give me a phone call after the webinar, I can certainly talk it through with you, just to get a bit more context. But I wouldn't automatically assume that you can do that kind of thing via Skype. But thanks for those questions. They're great. Really good questions. If there's anything else, any other comments people want to make or questions, as I just nip through our forthcoming repertoire of webinars, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. I said I'd talk for 40 minutes. I've got 2.5 minutes left. Neighbourhood mediation, Friday 13th of September. Fallouts between neighbours over noise, DIY, pets, parking, lifestyle. Be talking about that one on Friday 13th of September. We've trained thousands, actually, of neighbourhood workers, housing workers, people who are now in a position where they can go out and resolve these neighbourhood disputes. Massive application of mediation. It was the way that mediation first got put into full practice in this country in the late 70s, early 80s, actually, was in resolving neighbourhood disputes. Some of the lessons learned from that kind of work are now feeding into what we do as workplace mediators as well. So that's Friday 13th of September. Another one about becoming a workplace mediator. Friday 11th of October. So if you are thinking of becoming a mediator in workplaces to address grievance type issues, allegations of bullying and harassment, allegations of any form of unfair treatment, want to be a workplace mediator, we'll be going through that in some detail. We will be lifting the lid on how you go about right from the training right through to getting your first cases and what to do about that. So do join us for that one on Friday the 11th of October. And then the other one, part 2, about becoming a workplace mediator, is launching a mediation service. So all of the considerations, if your employer was setting up a panel of internal mediators, how would you go about that? So having an internal mediation service where you have panel mediators that you can call on to come out and mediate disputes. And we'll be talking about all the ins and outs of that on Friday the 8th of November. Another link has appeared. So we've got a link to our Interpersonal Mediation Practitioners Certificate course. You can find that on the website. That's the one that the guy did who was asking the question about the whether to use Skype for the dispute around some sexualized banter. And those are all of our webinars. You can also, we've given you the address for all the webinars off our website /webinars. So only remains for me to say that at the end of this webinar about social media, there's all our social media. So you can like and subscribe to us on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can connect with UK Mediation on LinkedIn. We've got two to LinkedIn accounts there, and check out our Facebook as well. There you go, there's our social media presence. Which brings me to exactly 40 minutes, I'm pleased to say, on this sunny Friday afternoon in Derbyshire. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your comments and questions. Very much appreciated. Do join us for any future webinars. I've been Mike Talbot, and I wish you a very nice weekend, and we'll be talking to you soon.